Glory to the King of Kings. Glory, glory, glory to the King of Kings. Lord, we lift up your name with hearts full of praise. Be exalted, O Lord my God. Hosanna in the highest. Now dismiss to class.
Okay, let's open up our Old Testaments, if you would, to 1 Samuel. We're going to continue our study this evening on King David. I want to tie up a couple of loose ends. Let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 24. That's where we studied last week. We kind of skipped through a bunch of stuff. I picked a character that you can't fully... You pick a character like David or Abraham, somebody like that, you can't give it due diligence in just a quarter. I mean, really. That's what, 14 Wednesdays? 12 Wednesdays, 14 Wednesdays, 14 hours, which to you probably seems like 140 days, you know. But you just really can't. You got to kind of pick the high points, and that's what I've tried to do. And we've got tonight and next Wednesday, and we will, tonight I want to talk about, we'll get into his 2 Samuel. We'll get into the first chapter of 2 Samuel and talk about him being crowned king, and he's taken over. He's the king now. And we'll talk a little bit about Absalom, his son, one of his sons tonight, if we have time. But, and then next week, I'll end the second half of the class in a little review of what we've studied this quarter. But the first half, I want to study about his sin with Bathsheba. Not necessarily the sin, but how he handled himself, how he reacted to that after Nathan came to him. That's what's important about that story, is how David handled it afterwards. And I want to talk about that the first half of the class next week. So that's in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12. So if you want to do your reading there, that's where we'll spend the biggest part of our time next week. But going back to chapter 24, we talked about that last week. We discussed that's where, David has been pretty much running for his life, running from King Saul, and he comes to this cave, and he's hidden in this cave, and Saul and his 3,000 men show up, and they the text, we talked about it last week, the men of David, the servants of David, said, this is your chance to get him. And you won't have any trouble. The Lord's with you. You can take him out. Well, David refused to take advantage of that because he knew it would not be right. You every decision that this young man makes just amazes you, has to amaze you at his youth and the wise decisions that he's making. And Saul, they meet, and David bows down to the ground and just truly respects Saul after all that he's done to him. He's tried to kill him on more than one occasion, threw a sword at him on more than one occasion, and David still keeps his cool, and because he knows the main reason is what? That David is keeping his cool here, and when he's with these encounters with Saul. And we briefly talked about it last week, but do you remember what David always says about Saul? He's just not anointed. He's the Lord's anointed. And David gives him that respect. He's respecting the office, not necessarily the person. And, we see that today. We may not respect the person that holds a particular office, but we have to respect the office itself. And, but anyway, that whole chapter, the whole chapter ends in a good tone. Saul is all, his feelings have been cured, of his bad feelings have been softened over David. And they made an agreement, and so it was all good. Psalms 54 was written after this encounter. Let's turn, and we'd ran out of time last week. Let's turn over to Psalms, the 54th Psalm. The 57th Psalm. 57th Psalm. Now, with this encounter, this cave encounter in mind, with him being trapped, he escapes, he refuses to take revenge like most people probably would. With all those things in mind, David writes this psalm after this encounter. So let's read it together. Be merciful unto me, O God, be merciful unto me. For my soul trusteth in thee. Yea, in the shadow of thy wings will I make my refuge, until these calamities be overpast. I will cry unto God most high, unto God that performeth all things for me. He shall send from heaven, and save me from the reproach of him that would swallow me up. God shall send forth his mercy and his truth. Now notice verse 4. My soul is among lions, and I lie even among them that are set on fire, even the sons of men, whose teeth are spears and arrows, and their tongue a sharp sword. Be thou exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let thy glory be above all the earth. Look at verse 6. They have prepared a net for my steps. My soul is bowed down. They have digged a pit before me, into the midst whereof they are fallen themselves. My heart, verse 7, my heart is fixed, O God. My heart is fixed. I will sing and give praise. Awake up, my glory. Awake, psaltery and harp. I myself will awake early. I will praise thee, O Lord, among the people. I will sing unto thee among the nations. For thy mercy is great unto the heavens, and thy truth unto the clouds. Be thou exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let thy glory be above all the earth. After escaping Saul, he's running from him, and he writes this psalm, giving praise and glory to God the Father. It's a wonderful lesson that we learn here. He said, in verse 7, my heart is fixed, O God. He says it twice. My heart is fixed, O God. My heart is fixed. What does he mean when he says my heart is fixed? What does that mean? Determined or set. The other versions have a different term there. Steadfast. Established. David has his mind made up on what he wants to do. He's going to serve the Lord no matter what. If he's running, escaping, fleeing, if he's on the throne, he's got his mind made up what he's going to do. And that's the lesson here. Any questions about 1 Samuel 24? Okay. Now let's skip over to the end of the book. I'm sorry, not yet. What happens, 1 Samuel chapter 25, what happens the first verse there? Samuel died, and all the Israelites were gathered together and lamented him and buried him in his house at Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. They lamented him. They wailed. They wept. What was Samuel? Let's review a little bit. What was Samuel to the people? Prophet? Priest? One more. Judge. He ended the judgeship. He was the last judge. He was a prophet. And he was a priest. And he was the first prophet. He was the last judge and the first prophet. And he has died. And the Israelites, they look at when you look back at Saul, who did he turn to when things were going? He didn't turn to the Lord nearly enough. Who did he turn to? He went to Samuel. David. When David, his first time to flee from King Saul, he goes to Samuel. He goes to Ramah, where Samuel lived. That's where David went. So here's a mentor that has died, and he's no longer living. And the text says all the Israelites were gathered together, and they lamented him. They wailed, they mourned, they wept. Now, let's go to the end of the chapter. Chapter 30. Chapter 31. This is the death of Jonathan and Saul. They're still in battle with the Philistines. The Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. The Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, Saul's sons, his 3 sons. And the battle went sore against Saul, and the archers hit him. He was hit, and he was sore wounded of the archers. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, this is sad. And before I read this, he's hit. He's been in a lot of battles, and he finally gets hit. And he probably knows that this is the end. What do you suppose his mind's doing right now? Can you imagine what's going through Saul's mind right now? The Lord put him on the throne, and he took him off the throne because of Saul's disobedience. And his heart, when David entered the scene, his heart became full of pride and envy and jealousy and all of those other synonymous terms that you want to add to that because of David, his popularity. And here he is, he knows it's the end. What do you suppose is going through his mind? Regret? I would hope so, but the text doesn't tell us. That's just what, when I was studying this, that's what I thought. What do you think is going through Saul's mind right now? After all he's done, trying to kill David, what do you think? He's grievous because he lost his 3 sons, one of which, Jonathan, he tried to kill back earlier in the chapter because Jonathan was such good friends with David. I mean, it's a big blow. And, You know, I think of Queen Esther. Whenever she went before the king, I think that's right. She said, "If I perish, I perish. My life is in the Lord's hands. If I go before the king," she went before him uninvited. "And if I perish, I perish." And I think that's a lot the way David is. But I don't think that's what Saul's attitude is right here. His mindset. I mean, he knows it's the end. And I hope that his heart was full of regret for what he has been doing through this whole book, through more than half of this book. Roger.
He had visited the, what we call the witch of Endor. And Samuel had told him, "You will be with me today."
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We overlooked that. That's one of the chapters we skipped.
So he's had a lot of time to think about the fact that he's going to meet his maker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly.
I'm like, I don't know what he was thinking, but I hope he's making things
Right. Exactly. But Jonathan is dead. And Saul is hit by the archer. Verse 4, Saul said unto his armor-bearer, "Draw thy sword and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. Go ahead and finish me off." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and he fell on it himself, killed himself. And then when his armor-bearer saw what had happened, he did the same thing. He fell upon his sword and he died with him. Verse 6, so Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men that same day together. So that pretty much ends 1 Samuel. The death of Saul and his 3 sons. At this point in time, David does not know what has happened. And he has not yet received the news. But look down at the end of chapter 31, verse 11. And when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of that which the Philistines had done to Saul. Look what they did to him. We didn't even look at that. Look at verse 8. And when it came to pass on the morrow, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor and sent it into the land of the Philistines round about to publish it in the house of their idols and among the people, to display his body without the head. And they put his armor in the house of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the wall of Bethshan. A lot of respect they had, didn't they? And then verse 11, and when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of what the Philistines had done, they rose up, they went and got the body, and they did their own burial. Do you remember back earlier in this study, when Saul first took the kingship? Do you remember Jabesh Gilead? We had mentioned that. Boy, I'll buy you a donut if anybody gets this question right. What happened with Jabesh Gilead back earlier in Saul's reign? Do y'all remember?
They were besieged, and the enemy said that you can send for help, but if help doesn't come, you have to pluck out your eyes and be our servants.
And then what happened?
They sent for help, and Saul came.
Saul rescued him. He gets the donut. He's a visitor.
And I like Krispy Kreme.
You like Krispy Kreme. You got it. You got it. Very good. The first battle that Saul was in was rescuing Jabesh Gilead and those people. And that was his first star in his crown, lack of a better term. And here, those people find out about his death, and they break in and they took his body. They pretty much broke in at night and took his body from them, and they buried him themselves. So it says a lot about those people. They didn't forget one of the few good deeds that Saul did. Okay, 2 Samuel. Now it came to pass after the death of Saul, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, David found out, verse 4, David said unto him, How went the matter? This is the report coming back from the battle with the Philistines. I pray thee tell me. And he answered that the people are fled from the battle, and many of the people are so fallen and dead, and Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also. And then look up at verse 11 and 12. Then David took hold of his clothes, and he rent them, and likewise all the men that were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until even for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. He just lost his best friend. He just lost the best friend he ever had. And it was the son of the man that despised him more than anybody ever had. He just lost both of them. And still, he's given respect where respect is due, in weeping. He weeps. The text says he wept for both Jonathan and Saul. That's a hard pill to swallow. But David did it. And he's still young. He is still young. And I'm not really, there's some college age kids in this class, and we've never, when you study David, you think mainly that's going to be a study for college kids, high school kids, junior high kids. But I tell you what, this is a lesson that can be applied to every, I don't care if you're 18 or 88. This lesson applies to you with David. The life of David does. And granted, mainly there's more lessons in it for the younger people, but us older ones as well. And this is just one of them. When he wept for both Jonathan and Saul. He writes an elegy in the end of chapter 1, and beginning with verse 19. David writes this regarding, it's somewhat like a eulogy. It's a poem or a song for expressing sorrow for someone that has passed, and it's verse 19 through 27. Roger, if you would read those verses, please. Verses 19 through 27 of chapter 1 of 2 Samuel.
The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ascalon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. Ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew, let there be no rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty, vilely cast away, the shield of Saul, as though he had not been anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, O Jonathan, turn not back, and the sword of Saul return not empty. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. Oh, how the mighty are fallen in the midst of the battle. O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of a woman. How are the mighty fallen, and weapons of warfare?
Thank you. How are the mighty fallen? I've heard lessons on that. That's a good lesson title preachers like to use. How are the mighty fallen in verse 19, verse 25, and verse 27. Any questions thus far? Comments about the death of Alan?
The grief is maybe different for each one. For Jonathan, the love of Jonathan and respect and all. I think a lot of the grief for Saul is for the kingdom and for the fact that he was God's anointed, and that this is a very dark time for Israel and for one that's anointed by God. Ultimately, I guess it's respect for God, and the fact that the nations around might blaspheme God, feel like they've triumphed over him.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Chapter 5. 2 Samuel chapter 5. The people anoint David as king over Israel. Verse 3, so all the elders of Israel came to the king to Hebron, and King David made a league with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. And David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. So, he was 70 years old when he died. He died as king. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7.5 years, and in Israel, he reigned the remaining 33 years. How many sons did David have? Anybody know? Okay. Flip back to chapter 3. Let's look at some of these names. Chapter 3, verse 2. David had sons born in Hebron, and the firstborn was Amnon. Does that name ring a bell? Does that sound familiar? Who was Amnon? What did he do? Remember?
Raped his half-sister.
Raped his half-sister, Tamar. Amnon and Tamar raped his half-sister. And the second was Chileab. I don't know how to pronounce these. The third was Absalom. We'll talk about him for just a little bit. And the fourth was Adonijah. The fifth was Stephatiah. And the sixth was Ithream. Now, flip over to back over to chapter 5. So in that list, probably the ones that we've heard of was Amnon and Absalom. Let's look at this list in chapter 5, beginning in verse 14. Shammua and Shobab and Nathan. That's not the prophet. That's another Nathan. Not much is known about this Nathan. And Solomon. We know that one. And the rest of those down there we don't know very much about. And I'm not going to attempt to, but I want to Amnon and Absalom in the first group that we live. And then over here, Solomon, the sons, and that's 17 sons that David had. And so there you have it, his lineage. Chapter 6, what famous occurrence happened in chapter 6? Uzzah, the ark. They were transporting the ark. It stumbled, it rocked, and Uzzah reached out and touched it, and he was smitten dead. We'll not discuss that. We all know that story. Now let's go to chapter 7. Chapter 7. And David here, what is he wanting to do in chapter 7? The ark has been absent. And David is bringing the Ark of the Covenant back. Well, what's David wanting to do? He's wanting what? He's wanting to build a temple. You know, here I live in cedar houses. I live in a cedar house. I mean, I have a nice structure to where I dwell. And Lord, you've only lived in what? Tents. And so we need to do something here. Well, Nathan, this is Nathan the prophet in chapter 7. The Lord says to Nathan, verse 2, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwelleth within curtains." And Nathan said to the king, "Go, do all that is in thine heart, for the Lord is with thee." So, you've got the green light, David. Verse 4, "And it came to pass that night that the word of the Lord came unto Nathan, saying, Go and tell your servant, my servant David, Thou shalt build me an house. Shalt thou build me an house for me to dwell in? Whereas I have not dwelt in any house since the time that I brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt, even to this day, but have walked in a tent and in a tabernacle. In all the places wherein I have walked, and with all the children of Israel spake I a word with any of the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to feed my people Israel, saying, Why build ye not me an house of cedar?" You know, I have been leading the Israelites for years. And I've taken them through the wilderness wanderings. I've done all of this. I'm the Lord. It's kind of somewhat of a comical. I don't need a house. But I tell you what, David, I'm going to build you a house. You don't need to build me one. I don't need one. But I'm going to build you one. And look at verse 12. "And when thy days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before thee." I put him in, and I took him out. "And thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever." What are those 5 verses making reference to? When it says, "I will build you a house, a kingdom that will last forever." What's that making reference to? The church. Can't be anything else. Let's look at some other verses. Acts chapter 2. Turn over to Acts 2. Peter's famous sermon, first gospel sermon. Acts chapter 2, verse 29. "Men and brethren, let me speak freely unto you of the patriarch David." Okay, that's this David that we're studying. "That he is both dead and buried." He's gone. "And his sepulchre is with us unto this day." We can see it. "Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him, that of the fruit of his loins, according to the flesh, he would raise up Christ to sit on his throne." That's what 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel 7 is making reference to. Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1. Verse 31. "And behold, thou shalt conceive in thy womb, and shalt bring forth a son, and shalt call his name Jesus. He shall be great, and shall be called the Son of the Highest. And the Lord God shall give unto him the throne of his father David. And he shall reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom there shall be no end. It shall last forever." One more. Psalms 132, the 132nd Psalm. There's a lot of verses making reference to this, and we're just going to touch on a couple of them. Psalm 132. Begin with verse 8. Arise, O Lord, into thy rest, thou and the ark of thy strength. Let thy priests be clothed with righteousness, and let thy saints shout for joy. For thy servant David's sake, turn not away the face of thine anointed. The Lord hath sworn in truth unto David. He will not turn from it. Of the fruit of thy body will I set up thy throne. If thy children will keep my covenant and my testimony that I shall teach them, their children shall also sit upon the throne forevermore. So, that's not giving that verse due diligence, but it's a key verse in the Old Testament referencing David, the lineage through David's seed, Abraham's seed, David's seed is going to bring us the Messiah. And his throne will be set up. The church will be set up. And when Peter was referencing that in Acts chapter 2, that's where he was referencing. We're almost out of time. Next week, we'll talk a little bit about Absalom, which we didn't get to tonight. We'll talk about Absalom. And then we will go into David, Bathsheba, and how he handled that situation after Nathan approached him. Thank you for your comments and your
If you're using your hymnal and would like to mark the song of invitation, that'll be number 285, Zion's Call. Before the invitation, we'll sing number 174, Christ arose. We'll sing all three verses in the chorus once after the third verse.